All right. Well, I only have, remember last week, John made a comment. None of you probably remember it, but John made a comment about having something like 40 slides. Um, I have like something like 36, and I thought you'd find this, if I can get it to, now I can't get it to go forward. There we go. I thought you might find this appropriate in light of my 36 slide presentation tonight. Before we get started. So I'll let you read that on your own and decide whether I'm a sadist or an idiot for having 35 slides. But anyway, I'm going to just jump right in. We're in the seventh chapter. Where our reading is only 8 verses tonight, 7 through 14, and picking up where John left off last night. Let me read these 8 verses for us, and then we'll dive into the study. He says, after this being um, the three beasts that John talked about last week that Daniel saw in his dream. So he says, after this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him, and a thousand thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. That should really resonate with us tonight as we think about the election, and we'll talk about this a little as we get to the 14th verse. But it's been fascinating to study Daniel, because we live in a pretty crazy time, and to some degree, all of us have been impacted by the uncertainty and the difficulty that has become life in 2020. Whether it's the protests and the rioting and the looting, or whether it's being impacted by COVID-19, actually contracting it, or having a loved one that has, or whether it's just not being able to find enough toilet paper. All of us have been impacted by this. Um, Daniel wasn't any stranger to difficulty. I don't know if he had an issue finding toilet paper, but he was no stranger to difficulty. God, interestingly, gave him this vision about 5.5 centuries before Christ, when he was in exile in Babylon. Jerusalem was, you remember, all the Jews were in exile. Jerusalem was in ruins, and there was no Israelite king. And their situation was extremely dire, and it had been that way for a long time, almost 70 years by this time. And it's in this context, I think, that God gave Daniel this dream. That I think the intent of this dream was to shock him, was to amaze him and comfort him at the same time. So Daniel wrote it down so that the Israelites that were living in exile in those days, and even though he didn't know it at the time, even to the saints living today, you and I would be shocked and amazed and comforted too. Um, I think we look at this and it can be somewhat disorienting. The dream was certainly disorienting, but the actual outline of the chapter is pretty simple. There are two clear sections in this chapter. The first section is the first half of the chapter, verses 1 through 14, Daniel's dream. And the second section is the explanation of that dream, the last 14 verses, where we're going to concentrate our time next week. But we know that Daniel's dream in verses 1 through 14 has four scene changes. And we see that when we see the words saw and looked in verses 1 and 2, verse 9, verse 11, and verse 13. And those, let's see here. The four scene changes are the four great beasts that Daniel sees and describes. The Ancient of Days takes his seat as judge, which we'll talk about tonight. The beasts are judged, and the fourth beast is destroyed. And the Ancient of Days gives the eternal kingdom to a figure, this mysterious figure called one like a son of man. We all know that's Jesus, but certainly Daniel would have been, would not have probably understood it in that context at least, but that's the dream, and that's the first half of the chapter. You know, if it sounds a bit familiar, it should. It probably means you were paying attention when we studied the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream in chapter 21. You remember that he saw the image made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, clay, and stone. And all of these chapters, 2, 7, and 8, are related because they reveal a sequence of four kingdoms, four Gentile kingdoms. And then we'll talk about tonight this fifth eternal kingdom that's coming. The other three beasts, the lion, the bear, and the leopard, John talked to us about last week. You recall that the first, the lion was the Neo-Babylonian Babylonian Empire, and that relates to the head of gold in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, because we remember, if you go back to chapter 2, we studied God told Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel's dream, "You are the head of gold." We know that the second kingdom was the Medo-Persian kingdom, and he's very explicit about this in chapter 8. We'll talk about in a few weeks. The ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And then the third kingdom that John talked about is Greece. And 8:21 very clearly says the goat is the king of Greece, and the goat and the ram are synonymous with the leopard and the bear that we talked about last week. Oops, excuse me. So we know that back up here. The bear was associated with the chest and the arms of the Medo-Persian Empire of Cyrus that Dan and John both talked about the last couple of weeks. And we know that the leopard is Alexander the Great, which was associated with the bronze, the middle, the thighs, and the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And Alexander, in chapter 8, is represented by the goat. As we move on, or we'll as we go through this verse by verse and kind of look at what Daniel talks about this fourth beast, and I can't help but wonder what Daniel had eaten for dinner.
Well, thank you.
What Daniel had eaten for dinner the night before he had this dream, because it was pretty amazing. It was more of a nightmare than it was a dream. So Daniel sees this fourth beast, and we know that this points to the Roman Empire, which was represented by the iron in Nebuchadnezzar's image of the vision of the image, or the statue. And the Roman Empire, we know, was the strongest and the most enduring of all of the of all of the empires. This beast, interestingly, is not associated with any kind of an earthly animal. It's nothing, it's very unique in that, unlike the other three kingdoms, it's not any kind of an animal that we know. Um, but we do know that it assimilated the various parts of the divided Greek Empire. We know, and Dan, I think, mentioned this when Alexander the Great died. His kingdom was parceled up among a number of his subordinate rulers, and they ruled. I've forgotten how many. I think I heard the number 40. That may be way off, but nonetheless, the kingdom that Alexander ruled was divided up among a number of different rulers, and ultimately it was taken over by Rome, and it's then the Roman Empire came into power for quite a long time, for something like 500 years, we know. So Daniel uses three words. He uses three words to describe this beast. He says the fourth beast is dreadful, meaning it's exceedingly fearful, or it's inspiring fear. He says it is terrible, from a root word that means burly or strong or mighty. And he said it was strong, which again is mighty. They all mean roughly the same thing. But it's an interesting description of the beast. And I'll have to ask you a rhetorical question, since you can't answer. Why do you suppose he used three similar words to describe the vision? Well, I believe that this is probably for emphasis, to just emphasize how incredibly awful this beast really was, how horrible this vision really was, and how unique this beast was. So Daniel was truly beyond frightening, I think, and beyond just looking frightening. Daniel uses some other descriptions of it. He said the beast was destructive, was incredibly destructive and cruel. It devoured with its great iron teeth. Said it broke in pieces, and it stamped with its feet what wasn't touched by its devouring and its breaking in pieces. In other words, it wreaked total destruction on its enemies, and that primarily is the beast that came before it. Back in chapter 2, we kind of saw a picture of this destructive nature when we saw that this fourth kingdom described as strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. Excuse me. But maybe the most terrifying thing about this beast was these these 10 horns that the thing, it was different in that it had 10 horns. He said, after I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. It's a unique characteristic that only the fourth beast had. In the ancient world, the horns were an expression of power and of fearsomeness of an animal. And the fourth beast was so strong that it had 10 horns. There's probably a correspondence between these 10 horns and the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. And then Daniel says in chapter 2, verse 8, there came up on, I can't keep this thing straight, I apologize. There came up among them another horn, a little one, with a mouth speaking great things. So this seems like this is probably the climactic and probably the most powerful ruler of this final dynasty, and in fact of all of history. And twice more Daniel mentions the mouth of the little horn that boasts great things in verses 11 and 20. And Daniel also says this little horn seemed greater than its companions and was different from the former ones, down in verses 20 and 24. But in particular, what we see is his little horn takes aim at two targets. He turns his arrogant tongue against God and against his people. In we'll talk more about this next week, but in verse 25, he will speak words against the Most High and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. But as much as this little horn is talk, he's not all talk. His threats give way to actual persecution that seemed to be successful for a period of time. Verses 21 and 22 says he made war with the saints and prevailed over them. That is, until the Ancient of Days came. But the question always arises: who or what were these 10 horns, and what do they mean? It's possible that they were sub-kings, if you will, under the Roman Empire, ruling different parts of the empire. At least some of them seem to have ruled. One of the things that makes this a little bit hard is some of them seem to have ruled simultaneously, because he says that 3 of them were uprooted by the little horn. So some commentators try to explain it as various literal kingdoms of the period up to 476 AD, but that doesn't really seem to quite fit as far as I was able to research and discover. What we know is the Roman Empire, which was described as being strong as iron, actually conquered the known world in 168 BC in the Third Macedonian War. This is your Jeopardy trivia for the night. By defeating the Greeks in the person of Perseus of Macedon at the Battle of Pydna. And under the Caesars, you remember Caesar was not a name, it was a title. Under the Caesars, the Roman Empire ruled the world from 168 BC to about 351 AD. Even though the Roman Empire was in power for another 125 years, it wasn't conquered by a fifth world power. It was actually divided. It was overrun by barbarian tribes from the north and decayed from within. Other commentators suggest this is a future kingdom. I believe that it's important to keep in mind that verses 1 and 2 tell us that this dream came to Daniel as he slept. So 3 times Daniel tells us it was at night, to make sure we get it. This is a dream. It's not, I don't believe it's intended to be a precise script, but it's a distant prophetic glimpse, as seeing in the dark. My MacArthur Study Bible said this about, Roman dominion fell apart in 476 AD, yet lived on in a divided status, but will be revived and return to great unified strength near Christ's second coming. Then it will be comprised of 10 parts under kings, as well as an 11th king, the Antichrist. So it's important to remember that while the 10 horns in Daniel's dream may not have had any, there may not have been specifically 10 kingdoms in Daniel's time, there's yet a future fulfillment of this. It's, I don't know how best to describe it. A lot of what we have to remember is that so much of prophecy has there's a dual fulfillment. There's the prophet Daniel was seeing a time frame that was 500 or so years out, and may not have even been aware that this prophecy would be fulfilled in another way in a couple of thousand years beyond that. So that there's always, I remember Pastor Tom, you probably can't see my hands, but he always talked about how the prophets could see a dual fulfillment, a near fulfillment and a far out, if you can see my hands. And so this prophecy, we're going to talk a lot more about this next, the yet future fulfillment of this prophecy in a couple of weeks. So I feel very confident and saying, well, I can't specifically associate the 10 kingdoms with kingdoms in the Roman Empire period of time. I feel real confident that this is at a very minimum has an as yet future fulfillment based on John's record in Revelation. He says, I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to the dragon, the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. So, this is the beast that John saw is very much a picture of the beast that Daniel is seeing in his dream. So just as there's a variety of interpretations of who the 10 horns will be in the future, and the most reliable, what we can say, I think, without any hesitation, and I'm treading on my own turf for next week's lesson, but we know that this little horn is the Antichrist, the one that John calls the Antichrist. If so, this is the first reference in Scripture to a being known as that we now know as the Antichrist. The beast has some human characteristics, eyes like a man and mouth that speaks great things, but it's especially characterized by its pride. We see again in Revelation where he says the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words and was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. So here we have a snapshot of world history. These evil powers that arise and they terrorize God's people. And that's the first scene, verses 2 through 8. And then, just like a 4-act play, we have a scene change in verse 9. And we have this one that comes on the scene called the Ancient of Days. And Daniel says, as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took a seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. And a stream of fire issued and came out from before him, and 1,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So from the terror of the 4 beasts, Daniel's vision takes a pivot, and he sees that thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, presiding over all of the nations and all of history. This is a judgment scene. This is the Ancient of Days comes to give and to execute his final judgment. So, who is this Ancient of Days? The Ancient of Days is used 4 times here or 3 times here in this chapter. It's used only by Daniel, and it's used to emphasize eternality. It's used to designate his place as the final judge of all history, of every nation and every individual. And of course, we know on this side of history that it's the name for God on his judgment seat. It's the one. This Ancient of Days is the one that was the causal factor in creation, and he's going to be the causal factor in bringing it all to a conclusion. And in that's we should take immense comfort in knowing that this Ancient of Days is going to be the one that brings it to a conclusion, not the 4th beast. It says in this is Psalm 90, verse 2, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So he is not only eternal, though. Daniel says he appears clothed in white. The clothed in white reflects his purity, his perfect purity. His hair is like pure wool, Daniel says, and that reflects his infinite wisdom. he's surrounded by fire that streams from his throne. It's a demonstration of his power to conquer, and his power to conquer any and every challenger. But when we think about God clothed in white and hair like wool, I think it's important before we get too far down that path that of thinking that God looks like some white-haired old gentleman. We ought to consider the words of John Calvin when he said, "We ought not to imagine God in his essence to be like any appearance to his own prophet or other holy fathers, but he put on various appearances according to man's comprehension, to whom he wished to give some signs of his presence." You know what the term anthropomorphism is? It's giving human characteristics to something that's not human. And the only way that human beings can imagine God is to give him human characteristics. So when we think of God dressed, clothed in white and hair like wool, we have to know that this is a description that allows us to comprehend God, not necessarily what he really looks like, because we know that God is spirit. So we are now the Ancient of Days is on his throne. It says in verse 10, the court sat at judgment, and the books were opened. Sorry, let me back up here. Having a hard time with my slides. So now the beast, that's the beauty of this whole scene, is the beast faces the final reckoning. The beast face their final reckoning for their evil. Every deed that's been seen and recorded in the books, and nothing slides past the Ancient of Days. So we see in verses 11 and 12 that the lives of the first three beasts were prolonged for a season and a time, but the fourth beast is immediately destroyed. When you think about it, that's an incredible thing, an incredible display of power by the Ancient of Days. As fierce, as intimidating, as powerful as these four beasts are, the Ancient of Days executes justice with seemingly no effort at all. There's no threat, there's no challenge, there's no struggle. He says the word and the great beast is destroyed. So this is what the book of Daniel has emphasized from the beginning. I'm sorry, that over and over, God is said to be the one who rules over the kingdom of man and gives dominion to whom he will and takes it when he so chooses. And I can't tell you how many times I've come back to this verse in the last few weeks. And Daniel, God repeats this 4 times in Daniel in chapters 4 and 5, that the Most High rules the kingdom of man and gives it to whom he will. And it's really important that as believers we cling to this verse, because again, no matter how, when we wake up tomorrow morning or whenever the final votes are counted, no matter who is president, we know that the Most High, the Ancient of Days, rules over the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. In 4:25 it says, again, the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. In 5:21 he says, the Most High rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. So we can take comfort. This is the message that God wanted the Israelites in captivity to hear from the very beginning, and this is the message that he wants us to hear. I'm sorry, I'm really having a problem with my slides tonight. And so the Ancient of Days, we find he just needs to snap his fingers. All he had to do was snap his fingers, or speak a word, maybe is a better way to put it. Just speak a word, and any human empire is destroyed. But it doesn't end there. He doesn't just take dominion away and destroy the fourth beast. He then gives his rulership of this kingdom to this divine human figure called the Son of Man. He says, I saw in night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So who is this Son of Man? Of course, we know that this is Jesus. It was Jesus' favorite descriptor for himself. He's referred to by himself and by other writers in the New Testament as the Son of Man 88 times in the New Testament. And just in case there was any question about it, he said to them, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me." And John sees this Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. And we hear this in Mark 14. This is an echo of what Jesus was probably referring to this passage in Daniel when he spoke these words in Mark 14. He said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Almost a direct quote there, that phrase, with the clouds of heaven, from the book of Daniel. And we see that God gives all authority to all dominion and authority are given by the Ancient of Days to the Son of Man. Jesus spoke about this transfer of power in these terms. He said in Luke 22, "But from now on the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And in John, he said, and he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Next week, we're going to unpack this more. But with all the chaos going on in our nation and our world, all of the difficulties that we face, we can hold on to the promise of a sure future where Jesus is on the throne at the right hand of God. This is our hope. And this is what we cling to now in this really dark time, just as it was Daniel and the hope of Daniel and the Israelites when they were in captivity in Babylon. And I'll close with this. In chapter 2, we read, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. So folks, again, I'm as concerned about you as the future of our nation, but I am comforted to know that the God of heaven rules a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. So with that, I'm going to leave the rest of it for next week as we finish up the interpretation of the dream.